The best version of Jesus that was left out of the Bible. What if everything you thought you knew about Jesus was only part of the story, not because it was false, but because it was incomplete? Pause for a moment and let that settle in. For centuries, his name has echoed across nations, whispered in prayers, declared in temples, carried through generations as the foundation of faith itself. People have built identities around him, shaped cultures around his teachings, and trusted that what they received was the full picture. But what if it was only a fragment of something far greater? This is not an attempt to break your faith. It is an invitation to deepen it. Because there is a difference between believing something you were taught and discovering something that transforms you from the inside out. The kind of truth that does not just sit comfortably in your mind, but unsettles your assumptions, challenges your patterns, and calls you into something real. Something alive. Think about how easily familiarity can become a blindfold. When you hear the same stories over and over, when the same image is repeated so many times that it feels unquestionable, you stop examining it. You stop asking. You accept it as complete. But history has shown again and again that what is repeated the most is not always what is most complete. Sometimes it is simply what was preserved, what was approved, what was considered safe enough to pass on. Now consider this carefully. What if the version of Jesus that became widely known was shaped, refined, and in some ways restrained so it could fit into structures, institutions, and expectations? Not necessarily out of malice, but out of control, order, and human limitation. And in that process, what if certain dimensions of who he truly was, how he spoke, how he confronted, how he awakened people, were gradually pushed to the margins? Because the Jesus who challenges systems is far less comfortable than the one who supports them. The Jesus who provokes deep inner transformation is harder to follow than the one who simply offers reassurance. The Jesus who calls you to confront yourself is far more demanding than the one who asks nothing beyond belief. And this is where things begin to shift. Because if there is more to him than what you have been shown, then this is not just about discovering new information. This is about facing a version of Jesus that may see you more clearly than you see yourself. A version that does not allow you to remain the same. A version that speaks directly into your life, not just as a distant figure from history, but as a living challenge to who you are becoming. So now the question becomes unavoidable. If that deeper, more complete understanding exists, why has it remained hidden in plain sight? Why do so many people feel something is missing, yet cannot explain what it is? And more importantly, what happens when you finally encounter it? Because once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Once you recognize it, you cannot return to what was comfortable before. And that is exactly where this journey begins. The enigma of a name that changed the world. There is no name in human history that has traveled as far, lasted as long, and carried as much weight as the name of Jesus. Empires have risen and fallen around it. Wars have been justified by it. Lives have been transformed because of it. And yet, despite all of that, there is a quiet, almost uncomfortable question that few people dare to ask. How can something so powerful be so familiar at the same time? Because familiarity creates an illusion. The more you hear something, the more you think you understand it. The more you repeat a name, the more you assume you know the person behind it. But repetition is not the same as revelation. Hearing is not the same as seeing. And knowing about someone is not the same as truly knowing who they are. Think about this carefully. From childhood, many people are introduced to Jesus through simplified narratives, softened images, carefully structured teachings designed to be accessible and easy to accept. A figure of peace, kindness, compassion, and sacrifice. And all of that is true. But what if that is only one layer of something far deeper, far more complex, and far more challenging? Because a name that changed the world does not carry that kind of impact by being simple. It carries that impact by touching something deeper than comfort. It confronts, it awakens, it disrupts. And yet, over time, the sharp edges of that impact can become rounded, polished, and easier to approach. Not because they were never there, but because people tend to preserve what they can manage, not what overwhelms them. And this is where the enigma begins. The name remains powerful, but the understanding becomes diluted. The influence remains global, but the depth becomes selective. People speak the name, sing the name, defend the name, but rarely stop to question whether they have encountered the fullness behind it or just the version that was passed down to them. Ask yourself this without rushing to answer. When you hear the name Jesus, what comes to mind first? Is it an image you were taught, a feeling you inherited, a belief you never questioned? Or is it something you discovered through your own search, your own struggle, your own awakening? Because there is a difference, and that difference changes everything. The truth is, a name can become so familiar that it loses its power to provoke curiosity. It becomes part of the background instead of the center of attention. It becomes something you carry without examining. And when that happens, the deeper meaning behind it begins to slip away, not because it disappeared, but because it was never fully pursued. Now consider the possibility that the real depth behind this name was never meant to be easily contained, that it was never meant to fit into simple explanations or comfortable categories, that it was designed to challenge perception, not reinforce it, to awaken something, not to settle it. Because if that is true, then the greatest mystery is not who Jesus was. The greatest mystery is how much of him has been reduced to something manageable. And if a name that powerful has been simplified, then what else has been quietly left behind? The construction of an acceptable image. At some point in history, something subtle began to happen. The figure of Jesus, once disruptive and impossible to ignore, started to become more understandable, more presentable, more acceptable. Not because his essence changed, but because the way people chose to present him did. And that shift, almost invisible at first, would shape the way generations came to see him. Because every message that spreads across time eventually passes through human hands, and human hands organize, interpret, simplify, and sometimes adjust what feels too intense, too complex, or too threatening. Not always with bad intentions, but with a need to make things fit into structures that can be taught, repeated, and maintained. Think about the power of an image that is easy to embrace. A Jesus who is always gentle, always calm, always predictable. A Jesus who comforts but rarely confronts, who welcomes but rarely disrupts, who inspires but does not demand deep internal change. That version is easier to accept, easier to share, and far less likely to challenge the systems built around it. But here is where the tension begins to rise. Because a figure capable of shifting the course of human history, of confronting authority, of speaking truths that unsettled entire communities, could not have been limited to a single emotional tone. There had to be intensity. There had to be moments that made people uncomfortable, moments that forced reflection, moments that demanded transformation instead of passive agreement. And yet, over time, those dimensions can become less visible. Not erased, but softened. Not removed, but overshadowed. The result is an image that feels complete on the surface, but lacks the weight that once made it impossible to ignore. Now consider this carefully. When a message becomes too comfortable, it stops provoking change. When a figure becomes too predictable, it stops challenging perception. And when something that was once alive becomes static, it risks losing the very force that made it transformative in the first place. This does not mean the widely known image of Jesus is false. It means it may be incomplete. It may represent only the aspects that were easier to preserve, easier to teach, easier to integrate into organized belief systems. But what about the parts that did not fit so easily? What about the words that cut deeper, the actions that challenged authority, the presence that demanded more than passive faith? Because if those elements were gradually minimized, then what remains is not a lie, but a filtered version. A version shaped by time, culture, and human limitation. A version that serves a purpose but may not reveal the full reality. And this leads to a question that cannot be ignored. If the image of Jesus was shaped to be more acceptable, what parts of him were considered too much, too intense, too radical, too transformative? Because whatever was left out may not have been less important. It may have been the very core of what made him impossible to control. And if that is true, then what you have known until now might only be the beginning of something far more challenging than you expected. Fragments of an incomplete story. There is something unsettling about realizing that a story you trusted may not be fully told. Not because it was intentionally hidden in a dramatic way, but because history itself is selective. What is preserved becomes truth for future generations, while what is left out slowly fades into silence. And silence, over time, can be mistaken for absence. When it comes to Jesus, most people assume that what has been passed down represents the whole narrative, every teaching, every moment, every word carefully documented and protected. But history does not work that way. No account, no matter how sacred, captures everything. There are always gaps. There are always moments that were not written, perspectives that were not included, voices that were not carried forward. Now stop and consider what that really means. If even a small portion of his life, his words, or his interactions were not recorded or were later set aside, then what you know is not the complete picture. It is a selection. A powerful one, yes. A meaningful one, absolutely. But still, a selection. And here is where things begin to deepen. Because what gets preserved is often what aligns with the direction that communities, leaders, or traditions are able to sustain. What gets left behind is not always what lacked value, but sometimes what was harder to interpret, harder to organize, or harder to control. This is not about creating doubt. It is about awakening awareness. Because there is a difference between rejecting what you know and recognizing that there may be more beyond it. And that awareness changes how you listen, how you question, how you seek. Think about the implications. What if some of the most challenging aspects of Jesus were not emphasized because they demanded too much? What if certain teachings that pushed people beyond comfort, beyond structure, beyond dependency, were not highlighted because they required a level of personal responsibility that few were ready to accept? Because a message that empowers individuals deeply can also disrupt systems. A message that calls for inner transformation over external conformity can be difficult to manage collectively. And over time, what is difficult to manage often becomes less visible. So what remains is a narrative that is true, but not necessarily complete. A story that inspires, but may not fully confront. A message that comforts, but may not fully awaken. And the most important question begins to surface. If there are fragments missing, if there are dimensions that were not fully carried forward, then what kind of understanding have you built your perception on? Because discovering that something is incomplete does not weaken it. It opens the door to something deeper. It invites you to look again, to listen differently, to search beyond what was handed to you without question. And once that door is open, it becomes impossible to ignore what might be waiting on the other side. The Jesus who did not fit into systems. There is a version of Jesus that history struggled to contain. Not because he was unclear, but because he was too clear, too direct, too alive to be confined within rigid structures. And that is where the tension begins. Because systems depend on order, predictability, and control, while his presence often disrupted all three. From the very beginning, he did not align himself with what people expected. He did not reinforce the authority that was already in place, nor did he adjust his message to make it more acceptable to those in power. Instead, he spoke in a way that exposed what was hidden, challenged what was comfortable, and questioned what people had stopped examining. This is the part that is often overlooked. Because it is easier to follow a figure who supports your structure than one who forces you to rethink it. It is easier to admire someone who fits into your understanding than someone who expands it beyond what feels safe. Think about how systems operate. They create rules, define boundaries, establish roles, and maintain stability. And while there is value in that, there is also a limitation. Because anything that threatens to move beyond those boundaries is often resisted, reinterpreted, or gradually reshaped until it can be managed. Now consider Jesus in that context, a man who spoke with authority without relying on established institutions, who connected directly with people without requiring intermediaries, who emphasized inner transformation over external compliance. That kind of presence does not strengthen systems, it challenges them at their core. And that is where things become uncomfortable. Because if his message was truly centered on awakening something within each person, then it reduces dependency on structures that position themselves as necessary for access, interpretation, or validation. It shifts the focus from external authority to internal awareness. Over time, that kind of message can be difficult to sustain in its original form. Not because it lacks truth, but because it demands responsibility. It requires people to look within, to question deeply, to engage personally instead of relying entirely on what is given to them. So what happens when something so powerful cannot be easily contained? It does not disappear. It becomes adapted. It becomes reframed in ways that allow it to coexist with the very systems it once challenged. Not fully removed, but gradually integrated in a way that reduces its disruptive force. And this is where a crucial realization emerges. The Jesus who fits perfectly into established systems may not be the same Jesus who originally stood outside of them. The version that aligns smoothly with structure may be different from the one who consistently moved beyond it. So now the question becomes unavoidable. If he did not come to fit into systems, but to challenge and transcend them, then what does that mean for how you understand him today? Because if you only know the version that fits, you may have never encountered the one who transforms. Words that went beyond time. There is something different about words that do not age, words that do not lose relevance, do not weaken with time, and do not depend on context to remain powerful. The words of Jesus carry that kind of weight. But what most people encounter is often a surface-level understanding, repeated so many times that it feels familiar, yet rarely explored in its full depth. Because words can be heard in two ways. You can hear them as information, something to remember, repeat, and agree with. Or you can hear them as an invitation, something that demands reflection, confrontation, and change. And the difference between those two ways of listening determines whether the message transforms you or simply passes through you. Think about how often his teachings are presented as moral guidance, as principles for good behavior, as a path to becoming a better person. And while that is part of it, it is not the full dimension. Because beneath the surface, there is a level of meaning that goes far beyond behavior. It speaks to identity. It speaks to awareness. It speaks to a complete reorientation of how you see yourself and the world around you. When he spoke, he was not just instructing. He was revealing, not just guiding actions, but awakening perception. His words were designed to reach a level deeper than logic, deeper than tradition, deeper than habit. They were meant to shift something internal, something that cannot be changed through external rules alone. But here is where something important happens. Over time, words that carry deep meaning can become simplified through repetition. They become easier to explain, easier to teach, easier to remember. And in that process, the complexity, the tension, and the depth can slowly fade into the background. Now consider this. What if many of his words were never meant to be comfortable? What if they were meant to challenge the way you think, the way you perceive reality, the way you understand your own existence? Because words that transform are not always easy to accept. They require you to pause, to question, to confront parts of yourself you would rather ignore. And yet, when those same words are presented in a simplified way, they can lose their edge. They become something you agree with instead of something that changes you, something you recognize instead of something that disrupts you. This is not about adding new meaning. It is about uncovering what may already be there, but has not been fully explored. Because when you begin to listen beyond the surface, you start to realize that those words are not limited to the time in which they were spoken. They are not confined to a specific culture or moment in history. They are alive in a different way, not because they are repeated, but because they continue to reveal something new each time they are truly examined. And that leads to a deeper question. If the words of Jesus were meant to awaken something within you, then what happens when you finally hear them in their full depth? Because once you do, they stop being just words. They become a mirror you cannot ignore. The message that was never meant to be comfortable. There is a reason why truly transformative messages are often resisted. Not because they are unclear, but because they demand something most people try to avoid. Change. Real, internal, undeniable change. And this is where the message of Jesus begins to take on a dimension that many have never fully faced. It is easy to embrace a message that comforts you, that reassures you, that tells you everything will be fine without requiring anything deeper in return. It is easy to follow something that fits into your current life without disrupting it. But the message that Jesus carried did not operate that way. It did not come to maintain who you are. It came to transform you completely. Think about what that really means. A message that calls you to look at yourself honestly, without filters, without excuses, without hiding behind what you have always believed about yourself. A message that asks you to let go of what is familiar, even when it feels safe. A message that challenges your identity, your habits, your attachments, and even the way you define truth. That is not comfortable. That is not easy. And that is precisely why it is so often softened over time. Because people naturally move toward what relieves tension, not what increases it. They prefer clarity that reassures over truth that confronts. And when a message begins to feel too demanding, too intense, too disruptive, there is a tendency to reinterpret it in a way that makes it easier to live with. Now consider how this applies here. What if many of the most challenging aspects of Jesus' message were gradually reframed so they would not push people too far? Not removed entirely, but presented in a way that reduces the urgency, the intensity, the personal responsibility that was originally there. Because a message that truly transforms cannot be passive. It does not allow you to remain the same while simply agreeing with it. It requires movement. It requires decision. It requires a willingness to step into something unknown. And this is where the real tension lies. Because if the message you have received has never deeply challenged you, never forced you to confront yourself, never required you to change in a meaningful way, then there is a possibility that you have only encountered a version of it that was made easier to accept. But the original message did not come to make life easier. It came to make life real, to strip away illusion, to expose what is hidden, to call people into a level of awareness and transformation that cannot be ignored once it is seen. So now ask yourself something that is difficult to avoid. Have you been following a message that comforts you or one that transforms you? Because those are not the same thing, and once you recognize the difference, you can no longer pretend not to see it. Between silence and interpretation, there is something powerful about what is said, but there is something even more revealing about what is left unsaid. Because silence is never empty. Silence carries decisions, priorities, and sometimes limitations. And when it comes to understanding Jesus, much of what people believe today exists somewhere between what was spoken and how it was later interpreted. From the moment his words began to spread, they were no longer experienced only by those who heard them directly. They passed through memory, through language, through culture, through generations of people trying to understand, explain, and preserve what they believed mattered most. And in that process, interpretation became unavoidable. But interpretation is not neutral. Every time something is explained, it is filtered through perspective, through beliefs, through context, through what the interpreter is capable of seeing and understanding at that moment. And while that does not make it wrong, it does mean that it may not be complete. Now think about the impact of that over time. One interpretation becomes accepted, then repeated, then established. It becomes familiar, it becomes authoritative. And eventually, it becomes so normalized that few people stop to question whether it is the only possible way to understand what was originally said. At the same time, other interpretations may fade, not because they lacked truth, but because they did not gain the same traction, the same acceptance, or the same ability to be sustained within growing structures of belief. And slowly, what remains visible is only part of a much wider spectrum of understanding. This is where the tension between silence and interpretation becomes critical. Because what is not emphasized can feel as though it never existed, and what is repeatedly emphasized can feel as though it is the full reality. But what if neither of those assumptions is entirely accurate? What if some of the most profound aspects of Jesus' message exist in the space between what was preserved and how it has been explained? In the subtle gaps where meaning was not fully captured, or where interpretation narrowed something that was originally broader, deeper, more alive? Because when something is reduced to a single explanation, it loses dimension. It loses movement. It becomes fixed instead of dynamic. And yet the words and presence of Jesus were anything but fixed. They were meant to be engaged with, wrestled with, discovered over time, not confined to a single, unchanging perspective. So now the question becomes more precise. Are you engaging with the message itself or with the interpretation of the message that was handed to you? Because there is a difference. And that difference determines whether you are exploring something alive or repeating something already defined. And once you begin to see that distinction, the silence starts to speak in a way you cannot ignore. The reflection forgotten within the human being. There is a dimension of Jesus that goes beyond what he taught and enters into what he revealed about human potential. Not just who he was, but what he reflected back to those who were willing to truly see. And this is where something profound and often overlooked begins to emerge. Because most people are taught to see Jesus as distant, elevated, unreachable, set apart in a way that places him far above ordinary human experience. And while there is truth in his uniqueness, there is also a deeper layer that is rarely explored. A layer that suggests he was not only showing who he is, but also pointing to what is possible within you. Think about the implications of that. If his life was not just an example to admire, but a mirror to recognize something within yourself, then the entire perspective shifts. It is no longer about observing from a distance. It becomes about awakening from within. But this idea is not comfortable, because it removes the excuse of distance. It removes the safety of saying that what he lived and embodied is beyond reach. Instead, it invites responsibility. It calls you to look at your own life, your own awareness, your own capacity for transformation, and ask whether you have been ignoring something that has always been there. Now consider how this perspective could have been gradually minimized. Because a message that emphasizes internal awakening changes the dynamic completely. It shifts the focus from dependency to responsibility, from external validation to internal alignment. And that kind of shift is not easy to maintain within systems that rely on structure and mediation. So over time, the emphasis may have moved away from what he reflected about humanity and toward what separated him from it. Not because the reflection was not there, but because it was more difficult to explain, more difficult to manage, and more demanding for those who encountered it. But if you look closely, the signs are still there. In the way he spoke about transformation, about becoming, about seeing beyond appearances. In the way he engaged with people, not as fixed identities, but as something more, something unfolding, something capable of change. And this leads to a question that cannot be avoided. What if the most powerful part of his message was not just about who he was, but about what he was showing you about yourself? Because if that is true, then ignoring it means missing something essential. Not about him, but about you. And once you begin to see that reflection, once you recognize that the distance may not be as absolute as you were taught, something shifts. You can no longer remain passive. You can no longer observe without engaging. Because what you are seeing is no longer just a figure from the past. It becomes a living invitation to step into something you may have never fully considered. The distance created by tradition. At some point, something subtle but powerful began to take shape. A distance. Not a physical distance, but a spiritual and psychological one. A space that slowly formed between people and the essence of what Jesus represented. And what makes this distance so complex is that it was not created overnight. It was built gradually, layer by layer, through traditions that were meant to preserve, but may have also unintentionally separated. Tradition has value. It carries memory, identity, continuity. It connects generations and provides structure in a world that constantly changes. But tradition also has a tendency to solidify what was once alive. It turns movement into method, experience into ritual, and discovery into repetition. Now think about how this applies to the message of Jesus. What began as something dynamic, personal, and deeply transformative slowly became something organized, structured, and in many cases mediated. Instead of direct engagement, there came processes. Instead of personal discovery, there came predefined interpretations. Instead of inner awakening, there came external practices. And here is where the distance begins to grow, because when something is placed within layers of tradition, it can start to feel farther away, not closer. It can feel like something you approach through steps rather than something you experience directly. something you participate in without necessarily encountering at its core. This does not mean tradition is wrong. It means it can become limiting when it replaces experience instead of supporting it, when it becomes the focus instead of the pathway, when it creates a sense that connection depends on following a system rather than engaging with something living and present. Now consider this carefully. If Jesus spoke in a way that invited direct awareness, direct transformation, direct connection, then anything that places distance between you and that experience changes the nature of the relationship. It shifts it from something immediate to something mediated, from something personal to something structured. And over time, that shift can become invisible. People grow accustomed to it. They accept it as normal. They assume that the distance is necessary, that it has always been this way, that there is no other way to approach what he represented. But what if that is not true? What if the distance is not essential but constructed? What if it was never meant to exist in the first place? What if the original invitation was always closer, more direct, more immediate than what has been experienced through layers of tradition? Because if that is the case, then something important has been overlooked. Not removed, not destroyed, but simply covered. Covered by practices, by expectations, by inherited ways of engaging that may no longer reflect the original depth of what was offered. And this leads to a realization that is difficult to ignore. If there is distance, it can be reduced. If there are layers, they can be seen through. If something has been placed between you and that original essence, it can be questioned. Because the moment you begin to question the distance, you begin to move closer. And once that movement starts, it becomes impossible to remain where you were before. The invitation that still echoes. There is something that has never been silenced, no matter how much time has passed, no matter how many interpretations have emerged, no matter how many layers have been added. Beneath everything, beyond tradition, beyond structure, beyond explanation, there is still an invitation. Quiet for some, undeniable for others, but always present. This invitation does not depend on institutions. It does not require permission. It does not wait for the perfect moment or the perfect understanding. It exists now, just as it existed then, reaching anyone who is willing to listen beyond noise, beyond assumption, beyond everything that has been repeated without reflection. Because what Jesus brought into the world was not meant to be locked into a specific time or place. It was not designed to expire, nor to belong only to those who came before you. It was meant to continue, to move, to reach beyond history and meet each person where they are, in the exact moment they are ready to see differently. But here is what makes this invitation so easy to miss. It does not force itself on you. It does not compete with distraction. It does not try to convince you through pressure. Instead, it waits. It remains available, but it requires awareness to be recognized. Think about how many times people search for something more, something real, something that goes beyond routine and repetition. They feel that something is missing, but they cannot define it. They follow what they were taught, they repeat what they learned, but deep down there is a quiet sense that there must be more than this. And that feeling is not accidental, because the invitation was never just about belief. It was about awakening. It was about stepping into a different level of awareness, a different way of seeing, a different way of living that cannot be reduced to rules or explained through simple concepts. Now consider this carefully. What if that invitation is not something you need to find somewhere else, but something you have been overlooking? Not because it is hidden, but because it does not present itself in the way you expected. It does not follow the patterns you are used to. It does not align with what feels comfortable or predictable. Because real invitations require a response. They require movement. They require a decision to engage instead of observe. And that is where most people hesitate. Not because they cannot see it, but because responding to it means stepping into something unknown. And yet, it continues to echo. It echoes in moments of questioning. It echoes in moments of clarity. It echoes when you begin to sense that what you have accepted may not be the full picture. It echoes when you feel that quiet pull towards something deeper, something more real than what you have experienced so far. So now the question is no longer whether the invitation exists. The question is whether you are willing to respond to it. Because once you do, everything begins to change. The truth that transforms and liberates. Now everything leads here, not to a conclusion that closes the story, but to a truth that opens something you can no longer ignore. Because after everything you have seen, everything you have questioned, everything you have begun to reconsider, one reality stands in front of you with clarity that cannot be avoided. The greatest truth was never hidden to be kept from you. It was left unrecognized because it demands more than passive belief. It demands awareness. It demands honesty. It demands that you step beyond what is comfortable and face what is real. And this is where everything shifts. Because the version of Jesus that may have been softened, filtered, or partially understood was never meant to limit you. It was meant to lead you. Not into dependency, but into transformation. Not into routine, but into awakening. Not into something distant, but into something that confronts you directly, here and now. Think about what that means for your life. If the message was always deeper than what you were shown, then the responsibility is no longer outside of you. It is within you. It is in the way you choose to see, to question, to respond. It is in whether you remain where you are or allow yourself to move into something more real. Because truth does not ask for your comfort. It asks for your willingness. It does not adjust itself to fit your expectations. It reveals where your expectations were too small. And once that truth is seen, it does not leave you the same. This is the part most people avoid. Not because it is unclear, but because it is undeniable. Because it removes every excuse. It removes the idea that you did not know, that you could not see, that you were waiting for something more. It places you face to face with the reality that the next step has always been yours to take. And this is where liberation begins. Not in having all the answers, but in recognizing that you are no longer confined by what you once assumed was complete. Not in rejecting what you knew, but in expanding beyond it. Not in following blindly, but in seeing clearly. Because the truth about Jesus was never just about understanding him. It was about what happens when you finally allow that understanding to transform you. And now there is no turning back to what felt simple before. Because once you see beyond the surface, once you recognize that there is more, once you feel that shift within you, everything changes. The way you think, the way you see, the way you live. And the only question that remains is this: what are you going to do with what you now see?